Zone of the Enders Second Runner is an interesting case. Like a good sequel, it builds on and expands on the world laid out by the first game. There was clearly a lot of hard work and ambition that went into making it. Unfortunately, it's also a game that sort of trips over its own ambition. The story starts off well enough. It even feels like you're watching a full-fledged anime, which shouldn't be too surprising when you consider the fact that it was around this time that Zone of the Enders had an OVA out as well. At the same time, this is where we also start to see some of the cracks begin to show. It definitely tries to tell a more mature story compared to the first, but the writing is hindered by a heavy amount of info dumping near the start of the game. In an attempt to tell a more complex story, I found myself not caring all that much for most of the plot. First, there's Dingo. After he and his friends are attacked by Baron, the antagonist from the first game, he discovers Jehudi hidden in the Jupiter moon of Callisto. In an effort to save his remaining friends, Dingo sneaks on board the Baron ship. He then gets captured while fighting Anubis and another orbital frame controlled by an AI based on Viola's memories from the first game. After Dingo suffers a life-threatening injury, he wakes up months later, attached to Jehudi's cockpit in order to keep him alive on a form of life support. Ken, the woman who saved Dingo's life, then forces him to work for the Space Defense Force by promising him she'll restore his health to be able to live outside of Jehudi's cockpit. This is plot point number 1. Plot point 2 is Dingo wanting to get revenge for his original team getting wiped out because his old boss betrayed him. The reason for this betrayal is also not fully explained beyond the villain basically saying that he just felt like it. Plot point number 3 is the conflict between the Space Defense Force and Baron. Plot point number 4 sort of ties in with 3, but sort of feels like something separate, is Mars gaining independence. Plot point number 5 is the character of Ken, who claims to be a spy for the Space Defense Force as her motivation is to find out who killed her father. Plot point number 6 is Jehudi and Ada being programmed to self-destruct inside an enemy base. This was presented back in the first game as well. Leo was against Ada self-destructing and has the same motivation in the sequel as well. Plot point number 7 is the pilot of Anubis wanting to trigger some kind of super weapon that would wipe out the solar system. His motivations are weak at best. At worst, they make no sense at all. The first game, on the other hand, had a simple straightforward plot. Enemies attack the colony of Antillia and attempt to capture 2 orbital frames, Anubis and Jehudi. Leo gets caught in the battle and stumbles into the cockpit of Jehudi. Leo then uses Jehudi to save the colony. There. A little oversimplified, I admit, but still pretty straightforward. By comparison, in Second Runner, there's so much going on that there's hardly any time to care for any part of the story. None of it is necessarily bad, but there also isn't much time to develop a meaningful connection with any of it either. It tries to be a story about all these different things, and in doing so, comes up short. Then there's the issue with the main character. As annoying as Leo could have been in the first game, especially in the beginning, Dingo is somehow worse. Even though he's older, Dingo is pettier than a little kid when being asked to do something. There's even a mission where you have to escort and defend Ken, all because Dingo was too petty to help her out in the beginning of the level, and the game's writing doesn't help him out either by not giving him much to work with in terms of dialogue lines. While I appreciate the effort that went into the story, and I acknowledge that there is definitely more story here compared to the first, I think it's actually a step down in quality. The script needed more time for a rewrite or two. It pains me to say this, but the story gets a 2 out of 5. There is a story here, but don't expect much out of it. To be fair, I may just be too old to look past the flaws. Maybe if I was 9 or 10 years old and this was my first exposure to storytelling in video games, I might feel differently about it. Next up is the voice acting and dialogue. Much like with the story, while there is definitely more of it in this game compared to the first, that sort of ends up being a fault. At least in the English dub, it comes across like maybe the voice actors didn't have a lot of time to say their lines and weren't given good direction. The material they were given also doesn't help them. Dingo, for example, at times tries to deliver some comedic relief that always falls flat. Other times, other characters will say something like, "What's your question?" or "What do you want to know?" and then right away say, "I'm not telling you anything," or "I don't have time for this." This also extremely hurts the main villain, as his lines almost lessen his character. When Anubis was first introduced in the first game, it comes across as a serious big-time villain, a true monster. In the sequel, however, Nomen, Anubis' pilot, doesn't know how to stop delivering bad dialogue. The only bright spot I have to say is Ada. Ada's dialogue in explaining how certain secondary weapons work is a huge improvement, since at least half of the secondary weapons in the first game hardly got used. Here, Ada will at least encourage you to use certain weapons in order to help you during a fight. It's never fun to do this, especially when I see that there's a clear amount of effort that went into it, but the dialogue and voice acting gets a 2 out of 5. Graphics and visuals are up next, both of which are actually really well done, even for a PS2 title being played in 2025. Sure, it won't exactly look like a new title if you play it on the PlayStation 4 or 5, but it won't look too bad. The orbital frames like Jehudi and Anubis, and even Leo's new orbital frame, all have some unique and standout designs. The other mechs and enemies all have a look that helps to give Zone of the Enders its own visual style as well. The CGI character models from the first game have all been replaced with full-fledged anime visuals, most of which actually look pretty good. The downside, however, is the lip syncing. Once you see it, and trust me, you will see it from the very beginning, it's hard to ignore. Now, I hardly care about having flawless lip syncing in games, or even in anime. For example, I'm a big fan of the original Life is Strange game, and even that didn't exactly have all that good lip syncing, but for whatever reason, the lips here in all the cutscenes are sped up. In the end, I think I will have to give it a 3 out of 5 for this category. Okay, next up, the music and sound design. In terms of the sound of the weapons, it's not that different from the first, but where it does improve on is on the music during the missions. In the previous game, there wasn't a single song or soundtrack that stood out to me during the gameplay. Here, you can be sure to recall at least 2 songs, maybe 3. It all helps to add to the atmosphere, to the missions, and to get you invested. Personally, I do prefer the main menu music from the first game, but beyond that, I think this is actually a step up. What all this does is help to further give the game its own unique identity. This is always a plus in my book, so because of its own unique sound, I will give it a 3 out of 5. Now for the most important part, the gameplay. The controls mostly handle the same. You can watch my video on the first Zone of the Enders if you want to know more about that. The only change they made worth noting is the lock-on. To release the lock-on, you now have to hold down L2. Combat-wise, there is definitely more of it here. There also are no avoiding enemies as an option anymore. All enemies will attack this time around. When it works, it makes for a lot of fun. When it doesn't, it can feel overwhelming and repetitive in the negative way. Some of the secondary weapons also have some improvements, and some even have a certain kind of weight or punch to them. There are also a lot more boss fights. Although I appreciate none of the bosses coming across as bullet sponges, they can also get a little overwhelming, especially during the first playthrough. Most, if not all bosses, have a certain pattern or a weakness that you're required to figure out. This is fine for the most part, and again, I do appreciate this, but some of these fights are placed so close to one another. Fight one boss and then immediately fight another, or at least fight a boss's second or third form. One reoccurring boss, for example, that happens relatively early on just gets old fast. In fact, upon reflecting my time with the game, it definitely felt like I spent more time fighting bosses than I did fighting the grunts. And then, lastly, there's the camera. Unfortunately, it's still the same as it was in the first game. To make it worse, this time around, you will be required to fly through some tunnels early on in the game. And these same tunnels expose early on the limitations of the camera controls. The first game had a lot of open areas, and so the camera was not a problem until later on. On the other hand, I will also admit that I do appreciate that the developers went through the trouble of making actual level designs for a mech game, since that is something that is rarely seen in most other mech games, that instead only makes some small open areas. I'm looking at you, Gundam. So I think I have to give the gameplay and controls 3 out of 5. Lastly, there's a new category I have. Originally, this was going to be an overall rating for determining how accessible a game is. But I've decided to change this to the game's overall or average length, a simple and more straightforward rating. If the game has a New Game Plus mode, I will also add a plus next to the score on the hexagon. This game is a little longer than the first, but still well under 10 hours. Between 6 to 8, maybe 9 hours if you really want to complete all the extra missions, and try to get a high overall rating for the campaign. Each score in this category is divided up by 15 hours. So depending on what you're looking for, a short, quick sub 10-hour story campaign or a 100-hour long RPG will determine if a high or low score is a good or bad thing for you. With all that being said, Zone of the Enders Second Runner gets a 1 out of 5 for game length, and with a plus at the end. No matter what your feelings may be towards a game, I feel like you have to respect any and all games that include a New Game Plus mode. As a quick reminder, I will never give games an overall score or rating, regardless of what the hexagon looks like. These are just the amount of focus points the game has in its stats. As for my own feelings towards Zone of the Enders second runner, although I do have more critiques for this one, it does have a certain charm to it. If I were to recommend it to anyone, I would say only play it if you played the first one already. The game is available for PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360 through the HD collection, and there's even a PlayStation 4 version that comes with the VR support. The VR mode is not really worth mentioning, to be honest though. And that does it for Zone of the Enders. This was pretty much all they wrote for the entire series. It did have an anime that came out around the same time as well. There were plans to make a third game, but when the HD collection failed to make enough sales, or Metal Gear Solid and Silent Hill sale numbers, Konami abandoned the project. Personally, I always criticize this strategy of re-releasing an old game to see if there's still interest in the property. Why would you expect someone to buy the same product that they already bought a few years ago? I can understand releasing it on Xbox. It was originally only available for PlayStation. But why would someone want to buy the HD collection for the PlayStation 3 if the PlayStation 3 was already backwards compatible with the PlayStation 2 games? At least for the older PlayStation 3 consoles anyways. And the game would still look good for its time. All this footage was captured on the PlayStation 2 version, by the way. Okay, I'm stopping it right here before I go any further on a rant. See you all next time. Thanks for watching. Bye now.
You have done well.